October 14th, 1066, just after sunrise. A cold wind sweeps across the ridge at Senlac Hill, carrying the smell of damp earth and sweat. Shields knock together in a tight wall of wood and iron. Boots grind into mud. Somewhere in the distance, a horn calls out, low, haunting, final. Arrows slice through the air with a hiss. A man gasps. Another screams. And then, the ground itself seems to tremble as thousands begin to move. The line holds. For now, on one side stand the shield-bearers of Battle of Hastings, shoulder to shoulder, axes clenched, breath steady. They are tired. Many have already fought a brutal battle just weeks before. But they do not break. Not yet. On the other side, across the rising slope, banners ripple in the wind. The golden lions, the papal flag, and beneath them, a man who has crossed the sea for a crown, William the Conqueror. For a moment, everything pauses. Then chaos begins. This moment, violent, desperate, and decisive, did not come out of nowhere. It was the final collision of ambition, betrayal, and fate that had been building for months. Even years to understand why thousands of men now stand on this blood-soaked hill. We have to step back. Far from the clash of steel, in the quiet halls of power, a king had died in January 1066. Edward the Confessor passed away without a clear heir. No son, no direct successor, just a throne suddenly empty. And in medieval Europe, an empty throne was not a peaceful invitation. It was a spark. Several powerful men believed that crown belonged to them. One of them was Harold Godwin's son, a seasoned warrior, a respected noble, and at the time of Edward's death, the most powerful man in England. Within days, Harold was crowned king. The decision was swift, practical, supported by the English elite, but not everyone accepted it. Across the Channel, in Normandy, William believed something very different. He claimed that Edward had promised him the English throne years earlier. Even more explosive, William insisted that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support that claim. An oath broken. And in the 11th century, breaking such an oath was not just political, it was sacred. A betrayal of God. William began to prepare for war, but he was not the only one. From the north came another challenger, Harald Hardrada, the fierce Viking king of Norway. He too saw opportunity in England's uncertainty, and he too gathered forces. 3 men, 1 crown. The year 1066 was about to become a storm. While William assembled ships and men along the Norman coast, Harold Godwin's son faced an immediate threat. Hardrada had already invaded northern England. What followed was a forced march that would test even the strongest army. Harold and his men moved fast, relentless, covering nearly 300 kilometers in just days. Armor biting into skin, feet blistered. No rest, no hesitation. They reached the north in time. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold's army clashed with the Vikings in a brutal, close-quarters fight. Steel against steel, shield against shield. The air thick with blood and exhaustion. In the end, Harold won. Hardrada was killed. The Viking threat crushed. It should have been a moment of relief. But it wasn't, because even as Harold stood victorious in the north, another danger had already arrived in the south. William had crossed the sea. With a fleet of hundreds of ships, he landed on the southern coast of England. His army, composed of knights, archers, and infantry, began to advance inland. They burned villages, seized supplies, forced Harold's hand. There was no time to recover, no time to rebuild strength. Harold had to march again, south. The same men who had just fought a brutal battle now turned and moved once more. Fatigue settled deep into their bones. Muscles strained, but the king pushed forward. Because if he delayed, William would tighten his grip, and England would slip away. As Harold's army approached, they chose their ground carefully. A ridge near Hastings, high ground, a defensive advantage, the perfect place to make a stand. They formed a shield wall, one of the most formidable defensive tactics of the time. overlapping shields, locked tight. A human fortress. Behind it stood housecarls, elite warriors armed with massive two-handed axes capable of shattering armor and bone. Beside them, less experienced militia, farmers, laborers, men who had never faced a professional army like William's. But they stood anyway, because behind them, there was nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, William's army approached from below, disciplined, organized, battle-hardened. Unlike Harold's forces, William had cavalry, mounted knights who could charge with devastating force. He had archers trained to rain arrows from a distance. And perhaps most importantly, he had time to prepare. As dawn broke on October 14th, the two forces faced each other, and no speeches survive. No recorded last words, just tension, the kind that presses into your chest and makes every breath feel heavier. The Normans moved first. Archers stepped forward, drawing their bows. The first volley darkened the sky. Arrows fell like rain, but many struck the shields of the English wall, bouncing harmlessly away. Then came the infantry. They advanced uphill, struggling against gravity, against resistance, against men who refused to yield. The clash was immediate, violent. Axes swung. Shields splintered. Men screamed. The line bent, but did not break. Again and again, William's forces attacked, and again, the shield wall held. From a distance, it might have looked like nothing was changing, but up close, everything was. Every strike weakened arms. Every impact rattled bones. Every minute drained strength. And somewhere in that chaos, something unexpected began to happen. A ripple, a shift, a moment where discipline faltered, just slightly. Some Norman troops, believing their leader had fallen, began to pull back. Confusion spread. Panic flickered. For a heartbeat, it looked like the entire invasion might collapse. But then, William did something that would change everything. That he rode forward. He lifted his helmet. That he showed his face. Alive. And with that single act, he turned fear into fury. The retreat stopped. The attack resumed, stronger, more relentless than before. And as the battle dragged on, a dangerous pattern began to emerge, one that neither side fully understood yet, but would soon decide the fate of a kingdom, because the shield wall, as strong as it was, had one fatal weakness, and William was starting to see it. The fighting had already lasted for hours. By late morning, the slope of Senlac Hill was scarred with churned mud, broken shields, and bodies lying where they had fallen. The noise never stopped. Iron striking iron, men shouting in Norman French and Old English, horses screaming somewhere below the ridge. The shield wall still stood, but the men inside it were breathing harder now, arms shaking, fingers numb from gripping wood and steel. Across the field, William the Conqueror watched carefully. He had already seen something important. The English were strong when they stayed together. Their shield wall was nearly impossible to break head-on. Every Norman assault uphill had been punished. Infantry pushed back, knights unhorsed, archers forced to reposition. But when the English line moved, even slightly, cracks appeared, and cracks could spread. Another Norman attack rolled forward. Archers first again, arrows rising and falling in arcs over the battlefield. Many still struck shields or glanced off helmets, but some found gaps now. A shoulder exposed, a face lifted too soon, a man turning to shout. Then came the infantry. They climbed again, boots slipping in blood and mud. The English met them with brutal force. Axes rose and fell in heavy arcs, capable of cutting through armor and shields alike. Contemporary accounts describe housecarls, Harold's professional warriors, holding the center with frightening discipline. Meanwhile, mounted knights circled below the ridge, waiting for opportunities. The battlefield had become a test of endurance, but something unexpected had already happened earlier that morning, something historians still debate today. At one point during the fighting, Norman troops on one flank began to fall back down the hill. Some may have believed William had been killed. Others may simply have panicked under the ferocity of the English defense, and then the English line reacted. Instead of holding position, parts of it surged forward. Men broke formation to chase the retreating Normans downhill. In that moment, the shield wall opened, and once it opened, it could be attacked from multiple directions. William saw it. He responded immediately. He ordered his forces to turn and strike the pursuing English soldiers who had left the ridge. Norman cavalry wheeled around, charging into smaller groups now separated from the main defensive line. Infantry followed close behind. Those English warriors were brave, but bravery without formation was dangerous. Many were cut down. The survivors scrambled back up the hill. The line closed again, but not perfectly, and William understood something now. This could be repeated. Historians believe the Normans began using what looked like controlled retreats, what later writers describe as feigned flights. Whether every withdrawal was planned is still debated, but the effect is clear in the historical record. Again and again, parts of the Norman army pulled back, and again, some English fighters chased them. Each time it happened, the shield wall loosened. Just a little, just enough. Back and forth the battle went under the autumn sun of England. The ground between the armies became a chaotic strip of combat. Men running, turning, collapsing, shouting orders that disappeared into the noise. At the center of the English line stood Harold Godwin's son. Unlike many medieval kings who directed battles from safer distances, Harold remained close to the front. His position was marked by the royal banner, the famous fighting man's standard carried near him. That banner mattered. It was more than a symbol. It told every English soldier that the king was still alive, still holding as long as it stood. The army had a focal point. Time dragged on. Midday passed. Both sides were taking losses. Horses lay scattered across the slope. Broken spear shafts stuck out of the mud like jagged reeds. Some archers had run low on arrows and had to recover them from the ground or from fallen men. And yet, neither side had won. This was becoming something else entirely. Less a quick clash, more a grinding contest of will. Meanwhile, the Norman army still had advantages that slowly began to matter more. They had cavalry that could reposition quickly. They had mixed troop types, archers, infantry, and mounted knights working together. The English army, by contrast, relied almost entirely on infantry holding ground. That worked brilliantly on a ridge. But if the formation weakened, the consequences could spread fast. Another series of attacks came in waves. Archers fired again, but something subtle began to change. Some accounts suggest the Normans started adjusting their aim, sending arrows higher into the air so they would fall behind shields rather than strike directly into them. Arrows began landing inside the English line. Not many at first, but enough to unsettle men already exhausted from hours of fighting. Some historians believe this shift in archery tactics may have played a crucial role later in the battle. It's one of those small battlefield adaptations that rarely appears dramatic in the moment, yet can reshape everything. Below the hill, William kept moving along his lines. Sources from the period, especially the Bayeux Tapestry, one of the most important visual records of the Battle of Hastings, depict him constantly visible, riding, signaling, restoring order when units wavered. Leadership mattered in battles like this. When troops saw their commander alive and active, panic was less likely to spread. But on the English side, things were becoming more fragile. Remember, the army had marched north, fought a major battle at Stamford Bridge, then marched south again in just weeks. Many soldiers were already physically drained before Hastings even began. Now they had been fighting for hours without relief. Shields grew heavier, axes harder to lift, and every time part of the line chased a retreating enemy, the structure weakened again. Afternoon approached. Sunlight shifted lower across the battlefield. Long shadows stretched across the ridge. Dust and smoke mixed with the damp air. Then another Norman withdrawal began. Again, some English troops followed. Again, the formation opened. And again, Norman cavalry turned sharply, charging back into those who had left the safety of the shield wall. This pattern, attack, retreat, pursuit, counterattack, slowly chipped away at Harold's army, not all at once, but piece by piece. Some historians believe this phase of the battle lasted several hours, making it one of the most prolonged and intense engagements of the early medieval period in England. What makes Hastings so fascinating is that the outcome was far from obvious during most of the day. For long stretches, it looked as though the English might actually hold the ridge until the Normans exhausted themselves. And if that had happened, the invasion might have failed. William had crossed the Channel with enormous risk. If his army collapsed here, deep inside enemy territory, escape would have been extremely difficult. Everything, his claim to the throne, his reputation, even his survival, rested on what happened in these hours. Meanwhile, at the center of the English line, the royal banners still flew, but the battle was starting to tighten around it. Arrows were landing closer now. Norman units were pushing further up the slope than before, and the gaps forming in the shield wall were becoming harder to close. Quickly, the men around Harold were still fighting with determination, but fatigue was turning every movement slower, heavier, just a little less precise. Then, sometime in the late afternoon, something happened near the king's position that would become one of the most famous and debated moments in medieval history, a single arrow dot, or perhaps something else. Because when chroniclers later tried to describe what they saw, their accounts did not all agree, but they agreed on one thing. What happened next would change England forever. The light was fading, not darkness yet, but the golden edge of late afternoon had begun to sink, stretching long shadows across the torn hillside. The air felt heavier now, thicker. Every breath carried the metallic taste of blood and dust. The shield wall was still there, but it wasn't the same wall. Gaps had formed, small at first, then wider. Men shifted to fill them, but they were slower now. Arms trembled, shields dipped. The tight, unbreakable line that had held since morning was starting to fray at the center, beneath the royal banner. Harold Godwin's son remained. He had fought all day, watched men fall around him, felt the pressure building from every direction. Still, he stood, across the slope. William the Conqueror prepared for what would likely be the final push. His army had not broken. Now, the English line was beginning to. Another volley of arrows rose into the sky. This time, higher, looser, less direct, and more dangerous. They arced over the shields, dropped into the spaces behind them. Some struck wood, some struck earth, and some found flesh. Near the center of the English position, something happened, something small, almost invisible in the chaos. That a man flinched. Another turned. That a figure near the banner staggered. For centuries, historians have debated this moment. The famous image from the Bayeux Tapestry shows a figure, often identified as Harold, with an arrow striking his eye. Some accounts support this. Others suggest he may have been cut down later by Norman knights in close combat. There is no single, confirmed version, only fragments. But what matters is this. At some point in the late afternoon of the Battle of Hastings, the King of England fell. And when a king falls in the middle of a medieval battle, everything changes. The royal banner wavered. Then it dropped, for the men still fighting. That moment carried a message louder than any shouted command. Something was wrong, very wrong. Confusion spread first, then fear. The shield wall, already weakened, began to break apart. Some soldiers fought on, refusing to retreat. Others hesitated, unsure where to stand, unsure who was still alive to lead them. And William saw it. He did not wait. He ordered a full assault. Infantry surged forward, climbing the slope with renewed force. Cavalry followed, pushing into the openings that had finally appeared. Archers continued to fire, keeping pressure on any group that tried to reform. The battle that had been balanced for hours suddenly shifted, decisively. English resistance did not vanish all at once. Around the fallen king, his housecarls, those elite warriors, made a final stand. They fought with the same discipline they had shown all day, forming smaller defensive knots, cutting down anyone who came too close. But they were surrounded now, outnumbered, exhausted point one by one. They fell. Elsewhere on the ridge, parts of the English army began to retreat. Not an organized withdrawal, a collapse. Men turned and ran downhill, away from the fighting, away from the banners that no longer stood. Some tried to regroup further back. Others simply fled into the surrounding countryside. Norman forces pursued, not recklessly, but with enough pressure to prevent any recovery. There are accounts of a final stand at a place later known as the Malfosse, a deep ditch or gully where fleeing English soldiers made one last attempt to resist. Even there, the fighting was brutal. Even there, the outcome did not change as evening approached. The battlefield fell silent. Not completely. There were still sounds, groans, movement, the quiet aftermath of violence. But the clash of armies was over. England had a new ruler. William the Conqueror stood victorious. The cost was immense. Thousands lay dead or wounded across Senlac Hill. The ground itself had been reshaped by the battle, torn apart by hours of relentless fighting. But the consequences would stretch far beyond this field, because Hastings was not just a battle that was a turning point in the months that followed. William moved to secure his control. Resistance did not disappear overnight. There were uprisings, rebellions, and years of consolidation. But the direction of power had changed. England was now under Norman rule, and with that came transformation. A new ruling class replaced the old Anglo-Saxon elite. Lands were redistributed to Norman lords. Castles, stone fortresses, began to rise across the country, symbols of both defense and control. Even the language began to shift. Norman French entered the vocabulary of power, law, and governance, blending over time with Old English to form what would eventually become modern English. The effects of that single day in 1066 would ripple forward for centuries. And yet, when we look back at the battle itself, what stands out is not just strategy or politics, that it's the human experience inside it. Men who had marched for days without rest, warriors who held a line for hours against impossible pressure, a king who chose to stand and fight rather than withdraw, and another who risked everything on a single invasion. History often feels inevitable when we look backward. But on that hill, nothing was certain. For most of the day, either side could have won. A stronger shield walled, a failed cavalry charged, a different moment of hesitation. And the story might have ended differently in Norman Conquest. No. William as king. A completely different path for England, and perhaps for the world that followed. That's what makes Hastings so powerful. That it reminds us how fragile history really is, how much can depend on a few hours to few decisions, even a single arrow. And somewhere in that fading light, as the last echoes of battle disappeared into the cold October evening, one question lingered over the field. If just one moment had gone differently, would we even recognize the world we live in today?